Hi, my name is Melinda Skirvin, and I'm here to speak to you about the American Indian culture. There are many different aspects of the American Indian culture. It's actually quite interesting. There are over 4.1 million people that identify themselves as an American Indian. There are 562 different federally recognized tribes. That represents about 1.5% of the American population, with the Navajo Indians as the largest group. The courts define an American Indian as someone that has identifiable Indian ancestry and that the Indian community themselves recognize as an Indian. Indians are actually scattered across the United States, and there are 562 different tribes, with 229 of those tribes in Alaska. 303 are scattered across the rest of the United States. The interesting thing to me was that the largest group, which is over 100,000, is in New York City, followed by LA, which you don't normally think about Indians being there, at 54,000, Phoenix, Arizona at 43,000, and Oklahoma City and Anchorage, Alaska at around 36,000. Communication is very different with an American Indian versus a Caucasian patient. They tend to be more on the quiet side and are not very demonstrative with their emotions. They don't express their emotions outwardly. They value listening over speaking and rely a lot on effective communication. So body language is very important when dealing with an American Indian. They do a lot more communication through facial expressions and body language. Storytelling is something that's very common with them. You do need to allow for time for them to tell their stories. And it's also very important not to have a direct gaze. With Caucasian patients, it's respectful to gaze directly, but not so with the American Indian. And American Indians don't believe in speaking for someone else. So it's important to direct any communication to the person that you should be speaking to. Another thing with the American Indian is they do not believe in disciplining and praising children in public. So that's done a lot in private, and you do need to be mindful of that when caring for an American Indian patient. The other thing is they unless a child is spoken to, they don't believe in the child, interrupting or being involved in a communication. Family roles are different with the American Indian. The men and women roles are actually pretty equal. There's a belief on interdependence, which is a mutual dependence between family members. And the focus is on the family, and it's the major context in the development of children. There's a lot of others involved in childbearing. There's extended family, aunts, uncles, grandparents, but there's also non-family members that are actually viewed as family members that can assist with developing the children and with the family unit. There are some biological features with the American Indian that are interesting. On the mitochondrial DNA, which is on the female side, there are 5 genetic markers called A, B, C, D, and X that are all considered Native American. And on the Y chromosome, there's 2 primary lineages called M3 and M45. But the most interesting fact to me was that almost exclusively all American Indians are O blood type. On physical characteristics, I think a lot of people are familiar with most of these. There's a brown skin tone, various shades of brown skin tones, somewhere in between Caucasian and African American. The skin tends to be a little bit thicker than a Caucasian patient's skin. The hair tends to be black, a little bit on the coarse side, and generally straight. The facial features are rounded face, and eyes are generally hazel brown and a little bit almond shaped, a little bit tipped on the edges. The lips are generally well formed, and the noses are a bit wider and shorter than Caucasian patients. And there's generally an absence of facial and body hair with men. There are a lot of common diseases with the American Indian, and I know two of the ones that I was a little bit more familiar with were alcohol abuse, alcoholism, and diabetes. And but there are also the cardiovascular diseases that kind of go along with diabetes, excuse me, which are stroke, congestive heart failure, hypertension, and high cholesterol. But they also suffer from arthritis and a lot of depression and suicide and post-traumatic stress disease, which could be related to the alcohol consumption or to some things that they've had to go through in their past. Nutrition is actually very different than what I anticipated. The nutrition is a lot higher in sugar and processed foods than I thought. When I think of an Indian, I kind of think of a very healthy, lifestyle, lean meats and grains and whole grains and corn and those kind of things. But actually the diet has changed over time and has become more dependent on government rations, which started in the 1890s. The rations are going on to this day, but they're very high in sugars and processed foods and those kind of things. And generally that results in a very poor nutrition. And again, there is a high alcohol intake. Pregnancy and childbearing, the American Indian generally uses a midwife, and the preference is not to have men in the delivery room, which is very different than the typical American Western culture. The preference is not to lay down. They hardly ever lay down, which is also very different. They stand, kneel, or sit. They take special care in preparation for the pregnancy, special care of their body, special exercise and cleansing. And sometimes they even use the use of a medicine man or shaman to help with bringing them an easy delivery. They're not necessarily in the delivery room, but they bring the ability to have a good, easy delivery. There's a community approach to childbearing, or child rearing rather. I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but there's a lot of involvement with extended family and with non-family members actually being seen as family members and assisting in the raising of the children. There's inductive discipline, which is discipline that is not physical in nature, but it allows the ability for the child to learn why they did something wrong and the reasoning behind why it's wrong. It allows children to actually reflect on their behavior and to develop some self-control. Storytelling is also very much a part of this culture and is passed on from generation to generation. Death rituals are very different than the traditional Western Caucasian type funerals. In general, they take a lot more time. Some parts of it take up to a year, but there's multiple days in the very beginning. Autopsies are frowned upon. There's a thought that the autopsy may affect the ability of the spirit to leave the body. So autopsies are something that they do not participate in, do not believe in. there are a few differences in general with a few of the tribes, and I'm going to go into that just a little bit, just because it was interesting. But in general, the thing to remember is that the American Indian views death very differently than the typical Caucasian patient. We believe it's an end, and the American Indian believes it's a beginning of another journey, and that there is a ceremony that needs to take place in order for that spirit to leave the body, and the body is a sanctified area and should not be should not have an autopsy, because that can affect the spirit leaving the body. In the Sioux tribe, the ceremony takes about 4 days, and again, death is seen as the beginning of a journey. And in this culture, or in this tribe, the bodies actually of the deceased is placed in their best clothing and then sewn up in some skins of an animal and placed either on a scaffold, as you see in my picture there, or in a tree. And it's left there with some rations, some food, and things like that, and left there actually for a year. And then at the end of that year, the journey should be complete and the body is actually buried. And in the Chippewa culture, I actually found out what a powwow was. But there's a powwow, and it lasts about 4 days as well. And in this culture, or this tribe, the body is buried, and there is a fire that takes place at the head of the area where the body is buried, and that fire allows for the spirits to leave the body. At the end of that, they use a medicine man, and they have the belongings of the deceased that they give to people of significance, and in return, those people give back something, and those items, along with a dish, are all given to the closest relative. That dish is actually used for every meal, and food is placed in it to honor the deceased for the next year, and then those items that they were given are then again given out to people that they find worthy of receiving those items. Spirituality is very different than the typical Western culture, Christianity. There is no Bible, or there's no written guidelines. Again, the spirituality, the spiritual direction is passed verbally from generation to generation through storytelling. There's a focus on nature, landscape, animals, plants, and environmental elements. It's actually really very difficult to define. There's a lot of symbolisms that involve animals, and there are ceremonies such as feast, dances, and music that are common in order to really understand the spirituality and the beliefs of the American Indian. You really have to spend quite a bit of time immersing yourself into it. And again, there's no written documentation, so it would require spending time with the American Indian and actually learning through storytelling and verbalization what the beliefs are. There are a lot of high-risk behaviors. I kind of alluded to this earlier in the presentation. Tobacco use is very high amongst the American Indians, as well as alcohol. Obesity is very prevalent. There's a lack of exercise and a poor diet that contributes to that. There is a lack of physician visits and medical screening in general. It could be for many different reasons. Some of the reasons are the mistrust that there is with the American Indian and the Western traditional doctors, but also they are in rural areas, and their services are a little bit limited through the Indian Health Services program. They the American Indians generally do not like to wear seatbelts. While we don't necessarily either, we tend to do it.